Welcome. Daf Yomi, if you've been reading, you know, is both a sprint and a marathon. And when we talk about highlights of Daf Yomi for this week, oh my God, it was a really rich week. There are so many highlights, and I will not do the highlights justice. We have reached in Masechet Yoma, the section of the Talmud that discusses Yom Kippur, the chapter that talks about the rituals for Yom Kippur that we still practice today. If you've been reading, you know the first chapters were all about the sacrifices in the temple and the rituals of the day that happened in the temple. And we got to the chapter that deals with contemporary rituals. And I'm going to focus a little bit today on a short passage connected to fasting, which in our North American Jewish community, although if anyone's here from Europe or South America or anywhere else, welcome. I'm just assuming most of us are North Americans because of the time on the call. Fasting on Yom Kippur, like attending a Pesach Seder and lighting Hanukkah candles, those are enduring Jewish practices that are spread throughout our community. People have an attachment to Yom Kippur, an attachment to fasting on the day, and it's one of those rituals that in surveys, the sociologists tell us, many of us Jews are really, higher percentages are engaged in fasting on Yom Kippur than lots of other Jewish practices. And we're going to look a little bit at how the rabbis deal with the tension between their desire for us and everyone to fast, and the notion that there are times when people, for individual circumstances, are unable to fast. And while it's easy, I think, in a vacuum for people or the rabbis to say, oh, you have certain special circumstances, it's okay not to fast, the pull to fasting and its connection to Yom Kippur is strong that sometimes it's not as easy for the rabbis to make exceptions that they want to make. And so that's what we're going to look at first. I'm going to share my screen and bring up some slides. And Julie will, I think you posted, but you might have to repost for the newcomers in the chat, is a link to these slides for you to view. All right, I am sharing my screen, and now I'm going to present. Here we go. All right. So, just in a couple of days, we're going to read this little snippet from the Mishna that says, if on Yom Kippur a pregnant woman smelled food and was overcome by a craving to eat one feeds her until she recovers. Right? So the Mishnah is very clear. Right? We fast on Yom Kippur, but women who are pregnant are in a different category. If women who are pregnant feel smell food or have some craving and they feel the need to eat, we let them eat until they feel better and the craving has passed and they recover. The commentaries and others talk about here that where a pregnant woman is carrying another life. We know the pregnancy taxes us women biologically, the pregnant woman, and when she's hungry, both for her safety and that of the fetus growing inside, we allow women to fast on Yom Kippur. We allow women to eat on Yom Kippur if they feel that they have some craving or smell food or need to do that. Sounds great. The Mishnah says women who are pregnant can be an exception to the obligation to fast on Yom Kippur, and it's fine for us to let them eat. Then we get to the Gemara, where we see the rabbis of the Gemara aren't fully on board with this, and you'll see why in a second. We're going to look at two snippets that tell two stories. They're sort of mirror images of themselves with a little bit of a different orientation. So the Gemara tells this story. A certain pregnant woman smelled a food and craved it. And those involved came before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to ask how to proceed. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is known for overseeing the project editing the Mishnah. So he knew the text, probably, we can assume, that we just studied. And people, the Mishnah might not have been spread out of the rules. People came to ask him, what do we do? Here's a pregnant woman who smelled food and she craved it. What do we do? And he said to those who were inquiring, go and whisper to her that today's Yom Kippur. So he doesn't say, oh, he doesn't say exactly what the Mishnah says, she craved food she can eat. He says, whisper her, remind her, hey, I know you just had a craving, but remember, it's Yom Kippur. And I think the implication here is if we remind her that it's Yom Kippur, maybe the craving or the hunger will pass and she won't need to fast. I mean, she won't need to break her fast. She won't want to eat. So they whispered to her, and this whispering helped, and the craving stopped. Look at that. Reminding her that it was Yom Kippur made it so that she decided she didn't need food. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi read the following verse about the baby she was carrying, a continuation of the story. He found a verse from Jeremiah. Before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. The I here is God. And before you came forth out of the womb, I sanctified you. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi gives a bracha to the fetus, and the babies are born, and out of that woman, the baby that's born is the fetus who becomes a baby and grows up to be Rabbi Yochanan, a great scholar of Torah in the rabbinic community. So notice how this story undoes the Mishnah a little bit. The Mishnah says, pregnant woman has a craving, wants to eat, feed her, let her eat till she feels better. And this says, well, let's whisper, and better, right? What happens? She doesn't eat. And look what happens. Her baby's Rabbi Yochanan. What, though, would have happened, you might be asking, or the Gemara is, if the woman had made a different decision? Well, that's the next story. I just switched slides. Similar with a little twist, right? A certain pregnant woman smelled food and had craving to eat on Yom Kippur. Those involved came before Rabbi Hanina, so a different sage, to ask how to proceed. And he said to them, whisper to her that today's Yom Kippur. So Rabbi Hanina says the same thing that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had. And they whispered to her, hey, it's Yom Kippur. Remember, you might not want to eat. But she didn't accept the whisper, and she continued to crave the food, which, as we know, according to the Mishnah, is totally okay for her to crave the food and eat it. But look what happens here. Rabbi Hanina read the following verse about the baby. The wicked are estranged from the womb, Psalms 58:4, meaning it's clear that they are estranged already in their mother's womb. There's some distance. And what happened? Indeed, there's an estrangement of the baby because it's not Rabbi Yochanan who gets born to this woman, but Shabtai, the hoarder of fruits. I don't know if you've heard of Shabtai, the hoarder of fruits, but the rabbis have. And Shabtai, the hoarder of fruits, was someone who was known for hoarding fruits during years of famine. He kept as much produce as possible, so he could, during years of famine, sell it at a high and inflated price and profit at the expense of the poor. Not behavior that the rabbis approved of, and here we see them saying, the woman who chose to eat based on her craving, well, her child didn't turn out so well. So part of what I think is interesting here is these stories are told and they undermine the Mishnah a little bit. One, the two sages in both stories don't just say to the pregnant woman, it's Yom Kippur, you have a craving, you should eat, because we're worried about your health and the health of your baby. They have an interim step. It's Yom Kippur, remember, so if you can manage your craving, that's better. And not only that, the choice the woman makes in these stories seems to have consequences. So I would say as a contemporary rabbi, I'm much happier with what the Mishnah says than the message of these stories in the Gemara. The Mishnah says a pregnant woman can eat. We know pregnant women need extra energy. They're eating for two. And the health and safety of the woman and her fetus and her child, to me, are more important than on Yom Kippur. Yeah, and I don't go where these stories go. But at the same time, I see here in these stories a pull that the rabbis feel like it's important to fast on Yom Kippur, and they want to have this extra step before feeding a pregnant woman to say, let's remind her it's Yom Kippur, and maybe that will help her manage her craving. And if she manages her craving well, then she won't have to eat, and fasting is better. Again, I don't stand in that camp, but that's the struggle sort of here in the Gemara. All right, so that's coming up, and if this interests you, you'll also see in the next couple pages some conversations about if you yourself are sick on Yom Kippur, To what degree do you get to determine if you can eat or not? To what degree do you need a doctor's advice? There's a very complicated sugya, piece of Talmud coming up, but if this is a type of conversation that interests you, there's a lot here in the week to come. All right, so that's step one. I have a second text to share with you, totally different concept. So I'm going on the highlights theme as Julie framed it. That was topic number one. Here's topic number two, although I do see a connection between this text and the ones I just saw. This text doesn't have anything specifically to do with Yom Kippur, but it's a teaching of Abaye, who's a rabbi in the Gemara. And he's sharing with us a Braita, which is a text from the time of the Mishna, that talks about the verse, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, right at the beginning of the V'ahavta paragraph of the Shema, you shall love the Lord your God. So Abaye said, it was taught in the Braita about this verse, and you shall love the Lord your God, which means that you shall make the name of heaven beloved. Right? The interpretation of this verse, you shall love the Lord your God, doesn't mean just that you have to love God, right? You have to make, right, the name of heaven, you have to make God beloved to yourself or potentially, beyond yourself to as many people as possible. So how do we do this? Asks Abaye, and he answers the whole question. One should do so in that he should read Torah, learn Mishnah, and serve Torah scholars, and he should be pleasant with people in his business transactions. So what I love about this text is the rabbis put above almost all mitzvot, Talmud Torah, right? Studying Torah is equal to all the other mitzvot, the rabbis say in a number of places. And here they say one way to show that we love God is to read Torah and learn Mishnah, right? To study, right? To support Torah scholars. But they add to that also, it's not exclusive, right? Loving God isn't only about connecting to Torah and those who embody Torah, but you should also be pleasant with people in business transactions. There's a way in which embodying Torah and making God's name beloved has to do with how we treat other people as well. It's not just about Torah, and it's not just about connecting to God through sacred text, but it's also about how we treat other people. Right? And Abaye says, what do people say about a person who does all these things? They say, this I kept the male gendered in the text. I'm going to read it gender neutral. Right? Fortunate is the parent of this person who taught them Torah, and fortunate is their teachers who taught them Torah, and woe to other people who haven't studied Torah. Right? So-and-so who taught him Torah, see how pleasant are his ways and how proper are his deeds. Right, that's a long way to say. If someone studies Torah, serves Torah scholars, and has positive, pleasant interactions with other people, that person's teachers and parents will shep nachas, we would say in Yiddish, right? They'll be proud of that person and have a bright future, moving forward. They should feel good about this person for embodying these values. So for me, this is one of those texts of the Gemara that we're going to encounter next week. That's a little nugget of a nice teaching of narrative. And I like how it gives positive attribution to study of Torah and interacting with other people. And this one, I like how it turns out better, right? In the text we saw before, we saw how the actions of the pregnant woman influenced the destiny of the fetus. I wasn't so comfortable with how that landed, but this text I like. The person who studies Torah and treats other people well, that leads them to a destiny where others can be proud of them, and they embody this verse, right? They embody V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. They embody the ways in which loving God. So you can love God. So they ascribe this verse to those people based on their actions, and it shows this nice balance that it's not just about Torah; it's about how we treat other people as well. So that was a little Talmud nugget I think it's a nugget that I found in the text. I have one last thing to share, and then the first part of today's sprint will be over, and then we'll open things up to comments and questions. I see the chat is running fast, so thanks for your comments. We'll try to get to them in a second. The end of next week, we're going to make a transition in Daf Yomi because Masachet Yoma is coming to an end. And Masachet Sukkah is starting. That's the next one. And if you're thinking about building a sukkah for the first time this fall, in some ways, Masachet Sukkah is one of the most practical Masachtot, because you can actually learn a lot about how you might construct a sukkah, although with all the prefab sukkahs that are available today, you don't need to know all the rules if you buy the kit. That's what we have in our house. Oh, wait, that was a page from last time. Sorry, there's an extra slide. We're going to learn at the end of next week. I thought I'd tease us a little bit with Sukkah at the end. So this is a little bit of a puzzle. There's some background you need to know after we read the text that I'll fill in for you. Rabbi Zera said to him, there, if one removes Ashtarot Karnaim, there is still shade. Here, if one removes the walls of a sukkah, there is no shade. Clear, right? All right, just kidding. The rabbis at the beginning of Masachet Sukkah are going to talk about what makes for a fit sukkah. And in part, they talk about the height requirement. The Mishna says a sukkah that's taller than 20 amot. An amah is an arm's length, about from your elbow to your fingertips. So 20 amot is the limit to the sukkah. Why? One opinion says anything taller than that, when you're in the sukkah, you're not getting the shade of the schach, the roof, you're getting the shade of the walls. And the essence of the sukkah for some of the rabbis is that it provides shade through its roof. So some rabbis say, well, if the issue is you need shade for the roof, you could never build a sukkah in the town Ashtarot Karnaim, which Rabbi Zera mentions. Why? Because it's a town that's in a valley between two mountains. And if you're in the town of Ashtarot Karnaim, there's always shade, and the shade is always from the mountains on either side. So if you're in a sukkah in Ashtarot Karnaim, you will never get shade from your sukkah, you'll get shade from the mountains. So maybe, if we want to say there's a cap to the height of the sukkah based on this idea of shade, people in Ashtarot Karnaim can't really celebrate Sukkot. And what does Rabbi Zera say? Well, if you're in Ashtarot Karnaim, you take away the mountains, you would get shade from your sukkah. And if you're anywhere else and you take away the walls of your sukkah that are too tall away, you still wouldn't get shade from the sukkah because the roof would be too high, right? And the sun wouldn't come down on you. So I hope I gave you the comments to look at that. I love this because of the imagining of mountains going away and the notion that there's a town somewhere because it's in a pretty valley that they can't do Sukkot. As we enter Masachet Sukkah at the end of next week, you'll encounter this and more conversations about Sukkah and what it looks like. And those are my highlights for the week. So that's we used about 2/3 of our time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to come back. I'm going to pull up the chat. Nice. So there's more. Julie, I don't know if you've been following the chat. I have to say, as I was following the text, not the chat.
Yes.
Did anything stand out that you think we should start with?
There was a comment from Susan that she's married to a physician and that health comes first. You have to take medications with any food necessary on Yom Kippur. Someone else, it's a kind of a comment and also a question. So it sounds like the woman's behavior, that is eating or not on Yom Kippur, is the cause of what kind of baby is born. Is that right? According to the rabbis.
Right. So I would say this. I think that's what the text wants us, is telling us. So the people who put this text together are saying the two pregnant women's decision-making was deterministic in terms of how their child comes out. And I think that section of the Gemara is presenting that. Personally, I reject that notion that, that our individual choices of Jewish practice impact the destiny of our children. But we do see that theme sometimes in Torah, sometimes in the rabbis. So the comment, whoever comment that was right there, their read of the text is accurate. I think that's what the Talmud is saying. And you're welcome to go with that. I personally, that doesn't fit into my theology and belief system.
There was a question early on, and I think there might be something new now. I'll scroll down in a second. Can you talk a little bit about settling the mind and also what seemed possibly like an some kind of eating disorder?
Oh, interesting. I think the settling the mind, right? I think some of the question in this text is about, is the craving, the desire to eat, a mental phenomenon or a physical phenomenon? And I think part of from the language of the rabbis, their sense is if we can settle the person's mind, that will help them control their hunger. I haven't thought about this in connection with what it might say about eating disorders. It's interesting to think about, fasting is something people do ritually. Fasting is something sometimes people do in terms of, it's a diet, right? There are all these fasting diets now, and there are healthy and unhealthy relationships to fasting and food. I think that's an interesting thought from that comment. I'd have to think about that some more to say any more than just reflecting on I think it's an important thing to think about fasting as a dietary practice, what's healthy and what's not, and fasting as a ritual practice, what's healthy and what's not. And this sugya is a little bit about that because, Rich, some of, as the comment from the physician, which is about, health is more important than Yom Kippur, so that, if you need to, you shouldn't skip your medicine, you shouldn't skip food if it will put your health at risk. There are other passages that I did not highlight that bring that value into the conversation. So.
Someone just commented there was a lot of discussion this week about the quantity that one may eat, a kosevet, so it's called, and the time requirements for eating. Can you comment on that?
Yes, the rabbis like to put in the Talmud like to put structure on things that are vague. So there's a big question that we dealt with for a number of pages, which is at what point is what you're doing eating? Right, if you were with us for Masechet Shabbat months ago, they did that with Shabbat, like trying to quantify, right? You can't write on Shabbat, and the rabbis were like, well, how much is writing? Do you have to write a whole word, or do you have to write a whole letter? It's the same thing with eating, right? How much food do I have to swallow before it's actually eating? And the rabbis tried to compare, right, both. There's a long discussion looking at some verses in the Torah to help get some hints from the Torah about what quantity to use. And they used a number of foods that sort of represented for them different food sizes, right? They looked at large dates and eggs, and there's a whole series of measurements. It's a long conversation that goes a number of pages to think about which systems of measurement for eating, apply on Yom Kippur. I actually think one of the daily dose of Talmuds, if I'm right, one of the daily dose of Talmuds this week talked about this a little more in depth. And I say that because I'm pretty sure, I think I wrote one. My challenge is I'm 2 weeks ahead on Daf Yomi because of my editorial deadline. So I'm working on Sukkah page 10 now. But I'm pretty sure I wrote about the quantities a couple weeks back, and it came out this week. So you might want to check out online to see some of that.
And one technical question, and then a broader question.
Sure.
So someone says, surely you can't actively eat that amount, the kosevet, just that if you did eat it, you would be liable. Is that right?
But you're not supposed to. Some of this becomes technical and has to do with sacrifices that you would be obligated for. But you're not supposed to eat. But the rabbis have defined the minimum quantity that makes eating. So, in some of the discussion, it's like if you were to intentionally eat something that's not food, you're consuming, right? You're swallowing something, but since it's not food, it's not eating. Oh, I would say so. When it's food, you're not supposed to eat, but it doesn't become eating till it's a certain quantity. But I think in the first question that you asked, Julie, is a big thing that relates to the answer here. It's why, and I didn't address this before, it was about both quantity and about time, right? How long do you have to consume this? Because, right, if you're allowed to like eat I don't know, a raisin size amount of food because it's smaller than like an egg size amount of food, technically you could eat a raisin and then 5 minutes later you can eat another raisin. Like, but there's a sense about over not just an individual swallow, but over the cumulative effect over time. So on Yom Kippur, the intentional eating of a smaller quantity of food than the quantity the rabbis determined in the Talmud is the limit, is okay. I wouldn't recommend it as part of the spiritual practice, but you haven't violated the prohibition from eating if you eat less than the quantity, even if you do it intentionally. But the rabbis put the timestamp over it so that you don't, over a series, have a series of small eatings that add up to a big eating, which then violates the principle. I hope that made sense.
It did. Speaking of spiritual practice, Nancy asks, in contemporary practice, do you think it is important to feel the affliction or to find ways to avoid?
Oh, that's a great question. I think about that a lot, not about the fasting, but where one of the prohibitions listed in the Mishna is that we don't wear leather sandals, red leather sandals on Yom Kippur. And in the days of the Talmud, right, that's what they wore, leather sandals. So not wearing leather sandals meant your feet were less comfortable than usual, right? You may notice, and you may yourself be one of these people who practice like me, right? I don't wear leather shoes on Yom Kippur, and instead I wear sneakers. And the non-leather sneakers, and I can tell you my non-leather sneakers are more comfortable than my dress shoes. So I think about this on Yom Kippur, like in following literally what the Mishnah says by wearing sneakers, I'm actually more comfortable on Yom Kippur, and maybe that defeats the purpose. So that with that mitzvah, I think about this a lot. I do think, Judaism isn't such an ascetic religion, meaning most of our we're about joy and celebration. We don't have so many days that are about afflicting our souls. I do think, for me anyways, refraining from eating and drinking and all the other things on the list help make the day a more serious day. While sometimes fasting makes me focus less by the end of the day, sometimes the fact that I'm fasting helps me focus more. And for me, in part, spiritually, it's about, I always notice on Yom Kippur how much time I have for Yom Kippur because I'm not making meals. And so it's not just avoiding the eating, but avoiding even the food preparation. And I know anyone who's in charge of a break fast probably has that dilemma because, like, you need the break fast to be ready for the people when the fast is over, but so you're doing all this work to prepare for that and not attending to like the themes of Yom Kippur, which for me is a crazy concept. But part of the day is that affliction. I do think it adds to the seriousness of it. And I think generally, the things on the list for Yom Kippur, it's moderate affliction. And in that sense, it's something that can enhance and not detract from the day. But I think we all have our own relationship with fasting and what it does to us and all the other things with what it does to us. I think it's worth thinking about. There's a lot of great literature about Yom Kippur and thinking about it, preparing and all those things that you could find. I bet if you Googled on My Jewish Learning, you searched on My Jewish Learning for books to read for Yom Kippur, you'll find a good list to help you prepare.